So welcome to the ninth class of as part of Reading Refugees, Reading Migration and online orientation course for college and university teachers organized by Calcutta Research Group with funding from the Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna. This is also part of our ongoing program on migration and forced migration studies, which has been generously supported by Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, as well as various universities and institutes in India. I am very happy to invite you to the ninth lecture of the series. Today, we have with us Dr. Mohamed ShafeeqKarinkurayil, who is going to speak on migration through objects. So Shafiq is an assistant professor at Manipal Center for Humanities, which is part of Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He has a PhD in cultural studies from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, and he researches visual culture, film studies, migration studies, and memory studies. In the past, Shafiq's research has been supported by the ICSSR CSDS PhD Fellowship, the DAD Fellowship, which is the German Academic Exchange Service, the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs grant, and the German Research Fellowship grant. He's presented papers in different national and international conferences, including the ASNEL, the GAST Joint Conference on Post-Colonial Justice in Potsdam, the South Asian Studies, European Conference on South Asian Studies at Warsaw and at Paris, and in the AAS in Asia, New Delhi. And his papers have appeared in EPW, Bioscope, South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, South Asian Diaspora, etc. One of the specific reasons why we asked Shafiq to speak to us today is because we've been talking about how the field of migration research is not limited to one method or one specific way of researching or one kind of voice. As part of that, we have had people from different disciplines addressing us. We have, as also is witnessed through the class constituency, that we have different kinds of people joining the classes. As a result of that, we have a set of lectures which are directed towards cultural objects of migration and how we read culture as something to be taken seriously into account in migration studies. So for that, I don't think there are better people than Shafiq and Darshana, who has joined us. Thank you, Darshana, for waking up super early to talk about migration and culture. So Shafiq, now the floor is yours. You can just share your screen and get started.
Yeah. Hello. Good evening. Thanks for this opportunity to CRG and especially Shamata. I have been working on migration to the Gulf countries from Kerala, South Indian state. And I've been looking at it through various different artifacts, cultural artifacts. And I had already shared a paper that I had written in this context. And I hope you have read the paper and the other papers too. One of the things, I mean, in the paper that I had already circulated, one of the things there is to look at migration through, look at migration in terms of aspiration. So, there are, if I have to, if I am to speak of the genesis of that paper, it's actually multi-directional in the sense that there are many reasons. There are many thoughts which came together, which finally resulted in that paper. One was that long back I had promised Shamata that I would write a paper on ship people, which I myself did not really know what it would mean, and which did not happen at all. But then I happened to read a paper, a very interesting paper on the symbolism of ship in Malabar in the context of Kerala. And when this happened, now, this is there in the background. And then I was already, I was already collecting photographs from Gulf migrants who were of my father's generation. So those people who had migrated sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, that's when my father went to the Gulf to find a job, and had stayed there for some 30 years, close to 40 years, had retired in the early 2000s, like my father. So I knew quite some people like that from my village, from villages around, and I was collecting photographs from them. Um, Primarily, as a way of looking at the Gulf through migrant eyes. Like, one thing that I was interested in, other than collecting my own photographs from different family relatives who used to be in the Gulf, but from also from generally from people, was to think about how did these migrants record the Gulf when they were young and migrant laborers in the Gulf, because that Gulf is quite different. It's one of those, as you know, it's one of those miracle stories told in modern world. Like this, there is a Malayalam movie which in fact, there is a very famous saying, from camel to Cadillac, like to look at the miracle that happened in the Arabian Gulf over the short period of like some 20 years or 30 years, like the kind of transformation which happened. And these migrants were part of that transformation. So I wanted to capture that transformation through these migrants' eyes. Now, as I was collecting these photographs, I happened to see this first photograph that I've kept in that article. These two brothers in front of this background, which shows Air India, a plane. And remember, I'm already seeing this some 30 years later or more later. And I know these two people. I mean, they are brothers, they are people I know what has happened to them. And, it struck me as prophetic. Like, it made me think that what does it mean in a culture which is permeated by this migrant condition. So that was the starting point. And then I of course there are theories to aid me, because I mean, this is one of those instances in which photography can predict the future. So I was immediately reminded of Christopher Pinney's work on the coming of photography in India, and especially how he speaks about photograph as prophecy, as one of those early sites in which an individual subject can be realized. A person can appear to be as himself or herself, rather than being part of an already defined unit like caste or community. Like, something, because it's a machine, like, this machine predicts a future which is culturally not available. I mean, this is in photograph, as you know. And this is how John Berger, for example, begins his ways of seeing, that we see before we read, we see before we even think, because I mean, seeing a kind of foreshadows, or even appears before maybe completely out of sync with the rest of the things, with how later how it might be conditioned by culture. So Christopher Pinney was making this point about this aspiration, like something, an aspirational quality of photograph, something of making things happen, of those things which hasn't happened yet. So that in fact was the beginning point. And then I was also looking at this other possibilities of studying photograph, and especially from contexts which are non-privileged. So because I mean, one thing about studying photograph this way is that I'm studying amateur photographs, right? I'm not looking at artists. I'm not looking at those I'm not looking at a condition in which photographs are explained away by reference to the people who made it. It's rather, I'm looking at these as because they are such stock images, they also say something more than the individual. And then the other project was also, to go back to construct migration as can be seen through this photography. So my another paper, Days of Plenty, was about trying to construct everyday life in a labor camp 30 years back in a construction site. These are migrants who constructed the town in which later, another 10 12 years later, I would go and live. So I was also looking at I was looking at the prehistory of Gulf that way, looking through these migrants' eyes. So these are simple photographs, photographs of them having food together, photographs of them, posing for a photo after playing volleyball. So these are everyday incidents from the camp, from this labor camp in which there are several nationalities. There are Somalis, Pakistanis, Indians, there are Egyptians. Different people are staying together. They are constructing something, and it is not as if things are what we call professional, because no one really has any designation. They are constantly keeping shifting jobs. It's all about the guy who was the protagonist in that, for that particular paper. He started staying in the camp even before he became an employee there. So he reaches there on one Thursday, and he starts his employment one Saturday. And all of this could happen because he has been sent by a powerful person. So I was trying to construct that kind of a labor history through these photographs. So basically, that is what I aimed to do in the studies. So today, basically, my idea was to look at the photograph also as an object which travels across these borders today, and what happens to them in the process, in the sense that even to make sense of that photograph, you have to assume these two places together, because the photographs are captured here, it goes there, it is developed there, comes back here with more photographs. So this, it is right in the production, the camera was purchased there, it was gifted here. So even in the production of these photographs, there is this entire transnationalism involved. What I will do today is to basically do what I'm familiar with, which is to show you three photographs, and maybe I'll make some. So there is no master plan to this class. I'm generally making some observations about these photographs, about how what can be studied through these photographs, what are the things that can be discussed around these photographs, and that is how the rest of this session would progress. So this is one of those stale images. It has gone bad. Uh, this is from this place called Badr Zayed, which is in UAE. It was taken around 1979. Now, what we have here are two migrant laborers. One of them has a briefcase. The other one has what is called a 2-in-1 Japanese recorder. And both of them, one of them has his shirt over his shoulders. It's like one of those Marlboro ads. The other one is wearing white shirt with what was then called Malaya lungi. It is supposedly Malaysia, coming from Singapore, Malaysia. It's that style, and it used to be something that migrants used to bring for for relatives, for people around them. So one thing which of course is interesting here, you can see the wire of this this audio cassette player, or you can see its cable lying trailing behind. One thing, see, this is what it gives. Basically what this gives is an idea of what this audio cassette meant. It is like a briefcase. This guy is holding this audio cassette player, right? Now if you look at this, holding this briefcase is if you especially look at this 80s movies, it is something that we associate with rich, influential people. And, it's not necessary that they are villains. A lot of roles played by Mammootty in Malayalam films usually used to have briefcases of this sort. He would be a lawyer, he would be a bank employee, he would be even be a detective, but he would have this briefcase. It was considered to be one of those things. In fact, in one movie he appears as himself, which is Number 20 Madras Mail. The moment you see him, you also see him holding a briefcase of this. So that was an early 90s movie. Now, if you look at the study on Peter Manuel's study on the arrival of the little tradition of music in India, he says that it was the Gulf migrants who brought cassette players to India. It was a turning point, because what happens is that in the next few years, India becomes like, this is completely a foreign product. Now, what is this this entire technology is that, you can not only play cassettes, but you can also record cassettes. That was what was different about this cassette player. And it was initially made by Japanese companies. And when it comes to India, and through, all these, what we call smuggling, through all these illegal markets, it does not stop in only those places where the migrants in India are from, like, Kerala or Gujarat, but spreads through the entire, hinterland of India. I mean, not the shores, but the landlocked places of India, and gives birth to what he calls the little tradition of music. So what happens is that in a few years, some 4 or 5 years or so, India becomes the second largest manufacturer. So this is happening. So this is happening in the early 70s, the coming of cassette recorders. The first, the beginning of this coming of cassette recorders by 1991. So it's a decade. By a decade, India becomes the second highest producer of audio cassettes in the world, only next to the US. But what happens in the same period, like, what happens in the from the beginning of the 80s to the late 80s, the beginning of the 90s, is that film music, Hindi film music, or generally film music, which used to have 90% share in all audio recordings in India, drops to 40%. Now, this is, you of course know that, this cassettes used to be an important, it was a revolution. Like, for example, revolutions like the Iranian Revolution, for example, is often attributed to, the prevalence of the smuggling of cassettes of religious sermons from elsewhere. So in India, what it did was to give birth to this alternate music, this little tradition of music. And one of those has to do, for example, just like how the audio cassettes came to Kerala, we also have at the same time. So in 1977, you have this very famous, phenomenal song called Dubai Letter Song, Dubai Kattu Paattu, which is basically, a wife writing to her husband who is in the Gulf. So the wife is in Kerala, about her travails, about about the desperation that she wants to be with her husband. Like, she's basically asking, what is the point if our youth is to be wasted, you being there in the desert and me here? It was by someone called S.A. Jamil, who used to be an amateur counselor. And he supposedly, the song came out of his conversations with these left behind wives of these Gulf migrants. So But the point here is not that the Gulf migrants brought, okay, this is a thing. I mean, this is the human element that perhaps a photograph can allow us to capture, which is that it's not like, okay, there are several things, okay, that money can buy. I buy this and I bring it here, and people make music. No, I mean, look at the configuration, look at this assemblage in front of you, look at how that two-in-one recorder, audio recorder is treated. That human element, like that element of glamour that was there to it, that element of foreignness that was there to it, that element of swag that is there to it, that is something which looking for these cultural artifacts allow us to see. Because so one of the things that I tried in the paper was to also look at subaltern cultures in terms of aspiration, like in terms of an aspiration which might be which is induced by capital, multinational capital. So I mean, rather than looking at subaltern cultures only as some kind of resistance to capital, it was also an attempt to look at what happens, like can we look at subaltern cultures in their desire for all these capitalist goods. What happens then? I now move on to the second picture. Now the second picture here is from Kerala. This was taken in 1980. We have here two brothers, two siblings, and one person who is their relative. Now there is a lot to say about this photograph. It has to, I mean, the fact that they are wearing quite clearly new, two of them are wearing new white munda. One could say dhoti, but that is not what it is. Munda, like this white wraparound. Then there is this, those flares, those white trousers that this guy in the center is wearing, and very importantly, the two watches. Now, one of the things that Nisha Matthew was saying in her paper, which I've shared with you on mobilities, but also in another paper, like there is another paper by Nisha Matthew. I have included one final screen on the work cited, so you would get the details there. But it's on partition and gold smuggling between Bombay, now Mumbai, Bombay and Dubai. Now, there is an important thing that she's saying, which is that, there is an inherent limitation in studying this illegal market, smuggling, in the when we limit it to the figure of the smuggler, because then what we are missing is the social balance of this entire operation. So I would really recommend that you also read the paper on this gold smuggling between Bombay and Dubai, because it has also to do with the partition of India. See, this, I mean, clearly she's pointing out a problem with this methodological nationalism, in which we forget to look at transnational system in which these things operate. Like, if when we get limited to studying things as if the national territories, the boundaries of the national territory is also the boundaries of conceptual territory, then obviously you miss this point. So there is the partition of India, there is the migration of the Hindus from Sindh to Dubai, because Sindh was a part of Pakistan, and then there are people who flee from Sindh to Dubai. I mean, initially they come to Bombay, but soon a lot of them go to Dubai, and then there is this gold market which basically thrives with these refugees from Kerala. So it's that entire network. And then you also have Now that is the point. Then you also have a social situation in which you tend to show your watch, for example, wristwatch, directly towards the camera. I mean, that is this mobility. When you understand it only in terms of like, okay, there is a smuggler, he is selling gold, and then he's earning lots of money. What you do not understand is what I call aspiration, but this entire process of mobility, social mobility involved in it, in the sense that one often tends to reduce gold or watch to commodities without really looking at their power, like the power in terms of status, the power to be treated in a particular way. I mean, two kinds of power. One, the power to act on others, which gold can bring, and the power to be treated in a particular way by others, which is often manifested in these consumer goods. Now, once we do not understand that part of it, it all gets reduced to this one smuggler and his all these underground, without really looking at the system, its meaning, like it's the structure, the syntax in which this thing makes meaning beyond someone making a lot of money. So this is what Nisha Matthew is doing in her papers, two papers. One is on gold smuggling between Bombay and Dubai, the other one between Kerala and Dubai. So, I mean, so this is in 1980. Now, if you look at what was happening in the consumer scene in India at that time, so I'm referring here to William Mazzarella's work on advertisement. This is a strange time, because this is the time in which the Indian advertising industry or the Indian production industry is going through a particular paradox. On the one hand, you need people to have aspirations to gear up productions, but on the other hand, you do not have the wherewithal to actually fulfill any of these aspirations. So basically, it practically meant this, which is that you advertise for products which do not exist in the market. Like, you see all of these things on Sundays in TVs, but you do not know even one shop where these things are sold. This is a particular paradox. But the thing is, now this is the context, also the context in which these watches make sense. And this is also the reason, and Ratish Radhakrishnan, for example, has mentioned how wrist watches became one of those codes for the Gulf money in Malayalam cinema. And he's speaking about cinema which came in the more towards the late 80s. Here, what this picture is from 1980. But you already see what is that, the idea of illicitness, because when this is also the time in which you have to order for a watch and wait for months for it to come to you, and this is that time. In those years when you couldn't really buy a watch from the shop, when you had to go through all these bureaucracies even to buy a watch, these people, uneducated school dropouts, they had access to this watch. So this is actually, so when globalization happened in the 90s, so William Mazzarella uses this term close distance, close hyphen distance, to suggest that there is this particular lure of foreign products, which is that I mean, he gives a good example of what happens, which is that in the beginning the idea was to capture the market as much as possible. But then soon a problem happened, which is that if everyone can afford these products, then what is its mark of distinction? He gives an example of a Coca-Cola ad in which an auto driver is shown to drink Coca-Cola to refresh himself. And then, when William Mazzarella speaks to people in his ethnographic work, there is this guy telling him, if an auto driver can also drink Coke, then, what is the point of Coke? Because this distinction was important to foreign products. So, and one of its distinction was to generate a sense of foreignness by consuming it. Like, I mean, these advertisements, they I mean, the reason why perhaps they show white people is to make us give this sense of being in a foreign country. I mean, you see all these you know wearing suit and jumping against the Kremlin. You clearly know that, I mean, these people are not in Russia or anything. But the sense of foreignness. But the thing is, imagine what is that sense of foreignness. I mean, you put that theory into this context and see what happens. Because these are people who, for whom foreignness is not just something that can be consumed, but also part of their laboring reality, right? Lived reality. Now there is this split which happens, because on the one hand, that place is related to hardship, lots of hardship, but at the same time it is also something that makes them distinct. Now this distinction is what is sought through these objects. Now you look at this photograph and you see the energy, the social energy there, which projects itself to the camera, which exists there as a mark of distinction, as that power which will command on how they are to be treated. That's, I mean, it's kind of a subaltern power. Like, I mean, in the sense that if you look at John Berger, he is saying that, if you divide the power, I mean, the kind of power which existed in Western civilization between men and women, the men had the power to act, while the women had the power to decide how to be acted upon. Like, their power exists, essentially lies in, it's a subaltern mode of power. So yes, and then I should now go to this. This is the third photograph, and uh, much to say about this photograph too, but I would rather focus on this one thing which is there on top of them. I mean, these are three flatmates who are in Abu Dhabi in the UAE in 1979. One of them, the guy who is wearing this kandura, this Arabic dress, has just returned from Kerala, and his two flatmates are, of course, you can see the watch and the iron box in one person's hand, and the other person is holding a Nido can on top. I mean, you look at that object, look at this Nido can, and imagine the kind of travels that it has done. I mean, this Nido can would have gone to Kerala, and this is one thing that you could not buy from the shops. Imagine this is 1979. At that time, so this is a milk powder. I mean, think about the technology, think about the marvel that goes into it. It goes to a village in Kerala, and maybe in the next time this guy is coming back, it comes back, and it is now packed with tenga. So that is what is written on that, maybe for this guy to not confuse it with anything else, and maybe because it has to be kept in the fridge soon. Tenga means coconut. It has come with grated coconut. You see this travel that this object would have taken. Like, it is part of a market, but even if you buy it with money, once it enters this place in which it cannot be bought, it is not a market product, it becomes something else. And now when it comes back to Gulf with tenga, with coconut, with grated coconut, and a grated coconut is like an essential component for many of these Malayali dishes. So, I mean, you can, of course, that you can make curry with onion and tomato. Another way of making curry is actually to put masala. I mean, you make milk out of coconut, and you put masala in it, and then you put stuff in it and boil. That's so it's a different. It's not this onion-based curry. It's a different kind of curry. Now, many of Malayali dishes are made with that base. Imagine this is the most authentic marker of Kerala, and it is now brought to to this place in this marker of what Gulf means, because what Gulf meant, and this is actually one of the recurring themes, is that it is fantasy land, but fantasy land when looked at it from Kerala. So this is what photographs do. So essentially, who is the audience of this photograph? This audience of this photograph, I mean, it is not. So one thing which is different, I would say, about this photograph is that it is not really one of those devices of memory. See, usually when people study domestic family photograph, it is always studied in terms of like, this is something that we have kept for future viewing, like perhaps that kind of chronology is not the dimension in which these photographs operate. I mean, this is meant for an audience for whom the Gulf is a fantasy, but a fantasy which basically has sustained generation after generation of migration to the Gulf. If I mean, think about the poverty of theory if one is to theorize migration only in terms of money. I think I would stop close here, and it's anyways time. So I would basically stop sharing and perhaps read a quote from Robin Jeffrey, who has this very landmark book on Kerala. The title of the book is Politics, Women and Well-Being, How Kerala Became a Model. So I am, this is about coconut, okay, and this I'm directly quoting from Robin Jeffrey. So quote begins here. You can do almost anything with coconuts except eat them as a staple food. The water in the nut provides a refreshing drink. The meat is a cooking ingredient. The oil extracted from the meat is used for cooking, lighting, bathing, and soap making. The residue of the pressed meat feeds cattle. The shell of the nut can be burned for fuel or made into utensils. The outer husk provides the rot-resistant fiber, coir, long prized by mariners for rope and netting. The bud of the tree gives a juice that quickly ferments into toddy, a pleasant, intoxicating drink rich in vitamin B. The palm fronds make an excellent thatch. Individual fronds marked with an iron stylus, long substituted for paper. A collection of stems make a good broom. The hollowed out trunk becomes a canoe for fishing. But by eating the products of the coconut palm alone, people cannot survive. Now, this is the quote from Robin Jeffrey. As promised, I should show you the work cited just so that it is there in the recording. Yes, so I hope this captures it. Okay, so I'll stop sharing here, and that's it. Thank you. So I think, yeah, now we'll have questions.
Thanks, Shafiq. Thank you for taking us through three very different objects, a recorder, a couple of watches, and a tin, to talk about how transnational, but in this instance, not necessarily transcontinental flows have shaped certain local, regional, yet transnational identities, how migration is not merely a study of numbers or of money, but also of objects that encapsulate aspirations and objects that show that one has indeed made it in the world. So there are several people here who will have much to say to you. One of them is our colleague Rajat Kanti Shur, who has worked on migrant women's music and other performances. But first, Kosturi has a question which she will speak. So we'll have a discussion for 17 minutes actually, because Shafiq stopped 2 minutes ahead of time. And then we shall move on to Darshana's lecture. So Kosturi, if you would.
Thank you so much, sir, for this way of method of looking into the question of migration. Never really related earlier so much, and never thought so much about it until once I was hearing and seeing the pictures. My question is actually more like it's more like a thought and not a very well-structured question. That's why I chose to speak it. When we look at migration through objects, and when I see the objects which you have, shared with us as picture, it includes people, right? Migration at the end of the day, it's about people. And as soon as we talk about the ethnography, through the medium of a picture, which is basically an archival source or a memory, which if you go back to 70s or 80s or 90s through different moments of time, I'm kind of remembering, when we look at this question of text and interpretation, this debate about textual interpretation, and when we read a text, we have to understand the context, and also it's about how you interpret that object. So my question, my inquiry is therefore related to this part, that if I, as a researcher, if I am looking at a context of, say, partition, if I look at a context of a crisis, a kind of where I get an archival source through pictures, through audio, or through video, or even through the pictures, how do we grapple with this idea of interpretation? For instance, the picture, as you very rightly point, certain symbolic associations with social mobility, class mobility, even cultural exchanges which happen through the objects which you shared. But how do we understand and grapple in ethnography with this idea of interpretation, and how, as a researcher, I'm interpreting these pictures, whereas in reality it might not be what the way it was, at that particular time? So how do I grapple with this as a methodological, issue? Thank you.
Let me try and answer this question. I mean, this is one question which is very important, which is very fundamental, and because of which it gets, I mean, it is, I'm sure it is more of a problem that we have, like, it's kind of like a reflexive thought, like, how do I do? Now, I think I would answer this question with recourse to perhaps the difference between, let's say, post-structuralism and critical grammar. Okay. So, for example, in post-structuralism, you take a word. So, because the word, the signifier, is considered the more important thing. You take this word and you see it as the word which has occupied its place against all possible substitutions. So you are actually looking at a word and saying, why didn't this guy use this particular word but this word? But the thing is, your reference is not to that guy. So obviously, I mean, this entire idea of the author is dead. The idea is that you have this, when interpretation happens, the interpretation has to happen against this entire background of language itself. It is obviously a scholarly thing to do. It is obviously it is the task of an interpreter to do. Now, critical grammar, on the other hand, would say that one has to always look at a signifier in terms of the range of the person speaking it, in the sense that the ultimate reference point of a signifier is the range of vocabulary available to this particular guy in history. Now, our one point of studying these things is to basically look at this particular thing, which is that what is the range that is available at a particular historical point, which kind of accounts for a particular choice, whether it is conscious or unconscious. So this idea that, am I interpreting it the way it should be interpreted, because what if the guy, or what if it did not mean this thing at all? Obviously, if we are to assume that the person who took the photograph knew what it is about, I mean, that in itself is a long order. But at the same time, ethnography kind of makes us aware of whatever they can consciously think of course, in hindsight. So, it might have meant very different the moment when a picture was taken, but the form gives us, the form of this particular photograph gives us an idea of the horizon against which they right. And ethnography also allows us in some ways, especially in terms of in those conditions in which recorded history does not exist, to kind of delimit a zone of possible enunciations. But at the same time, as a scholar, my job is also to recognize that I am already translating it for a scholarly audience. So if one is to assume that there is any kind of transparency between a real life experience and an academic paper, I think that is essentially mistaken. Which is why, this idea of there being a scholarly agency, that, of course, there is elicitation, photo elicitation. There's this conversation, but at the same time, to be aware that one is, of course, I mean, in the sense that I have made it clear to you, I'm also looking at other agendas. I'm looking at the future making possibility of photography. I'm looking at the role of aspiration in subaltern movements. Now, these are concerns within academia. I have no pretense that these are things that but I'm that were in the minds of these people who took these photographs. But I'm doing that conversion, I'm doing that translation, and I'm fully aware of it. So I do not, I mean, it is also to claim, I mean, not to claim any kind of transparency between what they thought or what they had in mind. Project. So is
Right,
that,
sir.
yeah.
Right. No, it gives me a good sense of what you're saying, but anyway, we can discuss it later. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kosturi, for the question, and thank you, Shafiq. This, I think, is a conversation that cannot end, primarily because we come from different, very, very different theoretical and political locations, and talking across disciplines is at times quite a minefield. But I shall remind everybody of the last two classes we had, one by Professor Paula Banerjee and the other by Dr. Shefali Jha, in which Professor Banerjee reminded us of the political project and the ethics that our ethnography and our research must always embody. And Dr. Jha reminded us of the importance in interpreting and situating our ethnography. So yeah, we have two questions. I shall read one out and then I shall ask Rafiqullah to ask his. But then we must move over to, then we'll have your answer and response, not answer. And then we will move on to Darshana's lecture. So the question is from Shudip Boshu. How is the object understood historically? The difficulty with still photographs is that it freezes time and gives an illusion of momentariness. Do objects then objectify relations, or do objects lose their facticity and dissolve as it were? Do we then think only about social status, and objects are then treated as a value? This is a question. And Rafiqullah, will you ask your question, and then Shafiq can respond to both together?
Hello, good evening, sir. I was more curious to see more pictures and some more objects, but I really wanted to know in the third picture, the third page, the one which you have shared over the head, you have the hill, and in the background I could see. I'm really curious to know what is there above the head. I mean, in the rack, is it a suitcase with multiple boxes? Thank you, sir.
So, Shafiq, if you respond, then after your response, we shall move on to Darshana's lecture.
Even though all these photographs are basically one moment, I'm looking at it 40 years later. And 40 years later, they exist because they are there in an album of the many hundreds of pictures that people would have taken. Some gets preserved for whatever reason, we do not know. It might be sheer accident, but one can see that they have been kept. But of course, as I've told you and as I've shown you, many of these photographs have not been looked at for years, so they are mostly decaying. They are stale, they have gone stale. But at the same time, there is something about that object itself. So there is no denying that there is something about that object itself beyond value or beyond status, which attracts us. This vitality to the object. That the fact that certain objects, maybe surely because of its color, perhaps, or surely because of this bulk that it conveys, perhaps. But of course, there is. There is, of course, a limitation to how we can actually address that aspect through looking at photograph. But one can, of course, know that it is not just about status or value. It has to definitely do with the objects themselves, with the kind of discourse that objects themselves can produce, with the kind of sheer power inherent in an object, maybe because of its labor, maybe because of its because of the contingencies involved in that labor. So yes, objects has to be understood as objects, yes, and as repositories of affects rather than only of meanings, of course. And yes, these are things that I also try. We are striving to do. There is no, I don't think there is a particular way of doing it which is ready at hand. It is, I think, a lot to do with how we convey it. It has much to do with how flexible we can, I think, make our language within the context of, because we are, let's not, I do not have the pretension to be anyone other than someone in the academia. And, within that, the rules of that academia, how much one can bend the rules is also a question that, that we constantly face. Yes, so that would be my answer. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, and Rafiqullah wanted to know something about the
Yes,
field.
I think it's a toolkit, but I cannot be sure of it. I think it's a toolkit. Yes.
So thanks, Shafiq, and thanks everybody for all your questions. One of the reasons why I wanted, I have only asked.
Thank you, Shamata. My final thanks. Yeah.
So I have actually told people what they have to speak on. So Shafiq's was very deliberately migration through objects, because we have the museums of material memory. We now have different kinds of partition archive projects which look at somebody's grandfather's transistor radio, which they carried through the long walk. Or we have, certain objects, say in Kirki village, in which we remember the people who were the original inhabitants of the village, but now they have been moved away due to urbanization and planned quote unquote development. So the next speaker for today is Dr. Darshan Sridhar, who comes to us straight out of teaching a migrant media course, which is another reason why we reached out to her. So Darshan Sridhar Mini is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication Arts, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests broadly include global media cultures, migrant media, South Asian cinema, and feminist media. Her work has been published in Feminist Media Histories, Film History, Bioscope, and South Asian Popular Culture. She's also the co-organizer of the Mellon Borghese project, Migrant Media, Activism, Visual Art, and Performance. So welcome, Darshana, and also welcome back to CRG, I think. Yeah, so Shafiq is a former participant of the annual winter course, and Darshana is also coming back to CRG after several years. So please proceed.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you, CRG, for doing this wonderful, course. I think it's always pedagogic value about migration. How do you teach it? And I'm glad that there is something of interest to CRG, and this course is of immense value to the participants. So let me just share my screen. So thanks, Shafeeq, for a great presentation on photographs and migrant memory. So the idea of migrant archives that Shafeeq pointed to, and also Samantha kind of ended her introduction with, is also something I'm interested in, because I consider that to be a living archive that constantly mutates and expands to include fragments of memory, but all the while haunted by this idea of loss and staleness. So that will be something that will run through my commentary as well. So there is a constitutional instability that is, it gets preserved, and for how long? And it goes back to what Shafeeq said about the idea of staleness, and how are these photographs remembered? At what point of time do you go back to your old albums to revisit these photographs? So something I thought was important was also to maybe, rethink this idea of migrant archives as not a self-directed phenomena where you're gathering all the documents and all the identity papers that will in many ways foreground your identity as someone who had been displaced, because that's not always a way of preserving one's memory. It might be unintentional, but at the same time, this is also attuned to the way in which immigration systems function all around the world. You are asking people to narrativize their experience about how their petition would fall under the category of a refugee or asylum seeker. So you're constantly being asked to toe a line, like asked to constantly think about what is it in your narrative or your experience of displacement that warrants another person to listen to your testimony, whether it's a valid testimony and the truth claims that come with it. So I thought it would be important for us to maybe start with a film like Deepan, where a former Sri Lankan Tamil militant played by Anthony Thasan Jesudasan, who is again in real life a former LTT child fighter, and he participated and witnessed the atrocities that were part of the Sri Lankan civil war. But after the war, when the war is in the kind of concluding stages, he, along with three other refugees in the camp, they kind of use passports of people who died in the war to flee Sri Lanka. They moved to France, and these people are not in any way connected through kinship bonds. They come across as a family because they have the passport and documents that belong to a real family of people who died in the war. So these three people come from the refugee camps. They're randomly picked up. They are but united by this idea to desire a kind of ability to move out of civil war situation, at the same time to turn a fresh page and move on. So in Deepan, what you see is this idea of a borrowal of a new life from the dead. But migrant archives can also be about public and a collective endeavor that takes the form of shared narratives and practices. So I want to invite you into looking at an art project by Alejandro Inurrieta called Carne Arena, which is basically a virtual reality project that pushes the viewer into thinking about what is to occupy the life of a migrant, what it is to actually go through this dangerous terrains, and to blur the space between the subject and the bystander. So the responsibility of the bystander to act, the responsibility of the bystander to be like an empathetic listener, and also to help you understand the fragment of the personal lives of the refugees. So the kind of virtual reality, immersive kind of opportunity given to the people to understand the migrants' life is again drawing from the narratives of the real Mexican and Central American refugees who have gone through this dangerous path to enter the United States. So the visitors are, and they are being asked scenarios to emerge as a survivor, whether you can actually navigate the situation. And this is basically, a kind of a new way of an empathy machine where migration or the issue of forcible kind of displacement is not anything happening in Mexico or Central America or Africa, but it's something which is part and parcel of the way mobility functions with this large area of globalization and the kind of flux of global media flows and goods and people. We are being forced into thinking about what it is to occupy and inhabit the zone of a migrant. And you also have other, video games, one of which you can see here. It's called the Migrant Trail. It's a video game that's introducing players into the hardships and perils coming into the Sonora Desert in Arizona, where the player occupies the subjectivity of an undocumented immigrant attempting to secure access to the border. So this is a project that has emerged from a research project called The Undocumented, which also ultimately became a film, expanding the zone of conversations happening about who a person, a guide who helped undocumented to cross the desert, but what are the kind of subject positions a coyote occupy when they are taking in a group of people to cross the desert? Do you leave behind, and under what conditions lives becomes disposable? So I just wanted to start with this idea of a private migrant archive that Shafeeq referred to, and also this idea of a public, celebratory, collective way of rethinking about the ethical questions that come up with migration. We talk about it, is to maybe showcase what it is to think about migrant archives in an expansive way, where it's not just private, but it's also public. But it is not just public, but it's also public in a very particular way, where it's constant back and forth movement between inhabiting the subjectivity of migrant and then slipping back into your normal life. So when you finish watching this virtual reality immersive kind of installation, you go back to your own lives. At that point, the migrant and his or her plight would not become a primary concern to you anymore. So before I start with my course design, which Samatha referred to in the introduction, I just want to give you a sense of what is migrant media, because we talk about migrant media all the time, but we do not have a definition to go with, because definition itself is a very loose and expanded way of thinking about the relationship between migration and media practices, both media representations of migration, as well as how migrants make use of media practices to refashion, reinvent, and to speak about their concerns in the host country. So these are a few kind of collective endeavors where you are rethinking about what it is to be a Syrian refugee and the questions of empathy that I referred to earlier. So I thought it's important for you to also get a sense of what my research project is and how I entered into migrant media per se, and ultimately ended up developing a graduate seminar on it. So my research basically looks at diasporic media practices among Malayali diasporic community in GCC. So just like Shafeeq, I'm also interested in basically exploring the proliferating migration scapes that connect in Kerala to GCC countries. And that allows for the formal and informal infrastructures that condition the production of migrant narratives. So there are, this actually includes a robust way in which migrants use mediums such as short films to document and render their experiences in the host country, and also support prospective migrants, in their journey by being part of this, really interesting group of people engaged in WhatsApp conversations, sending voice memos and WhatsApp clips on job opportunities and other migration-related advice and support. While this might seem like an informal way of aiding, to have satellite television programs catered to the needs of migrants through production of content that resonate with their needs, desires, and aspirations. So my work actually looks at the diasporic media practices and how they help us understand the infrastructural, cultural, and economic factors that contribute to the community building of migrants. So migrants' media use allow them to capture the emotional, psychological, and aspirational demands that comes up with the relocation to a host country. So by being neither here nor there, but here and there at the same time, migrants recreate their journeys, refashion, and advocate for their needs. And I study the digital media practices of the Kerala's diasporic community in the Middle East that are featured as part of the larger media ecology, which is otherwise called Pravasi circuit. So the sites I explore include labor camps, pirate markets, satellite television content produced by both migrants in the Middle East-based entertainment channels, as well as the India-based ones, and also the diasporic short film festivals that emerge as sites for socializing, identity building, and belongingness among the migrant communities. So to a great extent, my work draws from Appadura and Breckenridge's intervention in modernity at large, where they point out how both circulation of media images and movement of migrants create new disjunctures between identity, imagination, and location. There is a kind of a double movement that's implied here. Movement of both images that are constantly virally circulating, as well as mobile audiences who are actually brought together to create a script for using the technical affordances of mediums, like digital medium, for instance, to connect and be connected. So my interest in this area emerges from the broader focus of my research in technology in facilitating community formation. So the case of diasporic short filmmakers offers us a kind of a sense to understand the granular micro-level media and community making practices in the Middle Eastern Gulf. And in doing so, I attempt to explore the following set of broad questions about media production, circulation, and transnationalism. What may be understand of the diasporic media practices if we look at the dispersed bottom-up networks, which are at the same time tethered to national formations, but which simultaneously push against their homogenizing impulses. And relatedly, where does region feature in this map of transnationalism? Is there a way of maybe bypassing the nation state and think about region and transnational being in dialogue? So now moving on to the course design. So the main rationale behind the course was to familiarize the students on the need to think about how migration and media can be taken as conceptual categories to interrogate different paradigms of mobility and displacement that has become part and parcel of the global realities pertaining to globalization, neocolonialism, and the reinvigoration of populism worldwide. So when we speak about migrant media, there are different layers to tease out about the varied possibilities that we can map in the way they resonate with the social and cultural realities of our times. Be about the different ways media practices represent migration. That is like the easy way to go. If so, what possible modes of analysis can be used to understand methodological paradigms used to, tap into the conversation about mobility and movement, whether it's diasporic communities, asylum seekers, or refugees. But it can also be about self-representation by migrants using mediations that crisscrosses the making of migrant as they move through different institutional channels. So the course was making a conscious effort to basically distinguish, these media forms, these three different categories, essentially, asylum seeker, refugee, and diasporic community. While all of them are united by the idea of displacement, they are the way in which their entry point to understanding their subject positions as they engage with systemic kind of inequalities that basically demand people to, leave a country, leave a particular locale in order to aspire towards a better future. That's something which we were kind of interested in exploring. And that's why I used these three categories separately. And the course structure is also in many ways kind of constantly asking students to make these differences. At the same time, you look at it as part of the larger, broader category of migrant media. So the migrant is often seen as a placeholder, marking memories of empire or fears of globalization or a sense of impending catastrophe. So in one of the readings that I kind of assigned for today, Rubicarism, there is also a reference to migrant as a problem and how that is constructed as a discourse in the geospatial data visualization. So before we get into the course specific, let me give you a glimpse of the media material that we covered for the course. Let's take a look at a trailer from one of the films. And before we get there, a few questions for you to think through. And these are the questions I thought through with my students in the class. Is the migrant media same as ethnic media, or are there kind of overlaps between migrant media and diasporic media practices? How is migrant media envisaged on the policy front and as in the human rights platform? And how do migrant media practices incorporate intersectionality while discussing issues pertaining to social justice? How may migrant populations intervene in issues of global concern through their media production? So in my course, I had a specific set of learning outcomes that I want the students to have once they finish the course, once they kind of intellectual orientations, and the questions that they were asked to think through in a matter of a semester's time. So the kind of main points are out there. So basically, it's about representational nuance, ideological underpinnings, and the political rhetoric underlying debates on displacement and relocation. And I, as a faculty who is in the film area of the department, and my department is communication arts, I was also interested in understanding the aesthetics of the films that are produced and made available as part of migrant media, and also to read the migrant media features in them. We kind of pushed, against in terms of understanding why it is important for us to understand the larger Israeli-Palestinian issue if you are understanding the migrant media produced by Palestinian filmmakers, because historical and geographical context was important for me and for the students, because we are talking about students who have never seen films, any of these films, and most of these films were new to them. So we needed to place them in specific historical, geographical paradigms, placing them vis-a-vis the media produced from there, and say what is specific that these films are able to narrativize. And another question we engaged with in this course was to interrogate the varying patterns of desire, labor, and agential assertions that underlie migrant media. And one of the assignments I gave my students was to generate key terms pertaining to migrant and diasporic media. And this was a public facing part of my course, was to generate the terms so that any layman can understand what these terms mean. So we came up with a set of words that students worked on in a collaborative format. So they worked on this term and what this term means when you think about a project like migrant media. And also the last point I want to mention is also to think about conceptual categories, because like I mentioned earlier, migrant media is an expansive term. So you need to be like really focused on certain concepts that you can take away from the course. Like some of the concepts that I looked at include temporality in terms of the idea of waiting in detention camps, question about sovereignty, and a few others. So I'll get to that in a second, but you need students to have something to take away with them from the course. They cannot say that I've read so many, but I've not gained anything from this course. So the last class was also meant for giving a chance for the students to say, what is it that they gained out of the course? So learning outcomes on the first day lays out for them my expectations and the way in which I rationalize the course. But this will be like constantly revisited throughout the course to ensure that we are all on the same page. Now, Shakespeare and Zaatari is one of the films I want to show, and this is basically a film directed by a Syrian actor, Nawar Bulbul, who basically fled Syria because there were, people threatening him because of his political views. He moved to Jordan, and this whole film is shot in a refugee camp called Zaatari, where you have roughly around 150,000 refugees, of which 60,000 are children. So what he did was that Bulbul basically came there, trained the children, gave them this idea of what it is to stage a play, a Shakespearean play in a camp, but the play that's actually drawing a lot from the experiences the children had with the idea of tragedy. So King Lear and Hamlet were both staged by the children, and he was basically training them to do that. So let's take a quick look at the trailer of Shakespeare and Zaatari.
نحن أحفاد هذا الإله السوري اللي قال بيوم من الأيام حطن سيفك احمل معولك واتبعني لنزرع السلام والمحبة في كبد الأرض. ضلي قاعدة وراسك فوق.
حطين علي. كتابة تيجي قدامي.
قولي يا حلوة هذا العقول الصغيرة المدللة.
So basically, Man Mosley, who basically directed this film, he was doing a documentation of the process of, staging this and the healing process that it gave way to, because it was a short-term project and again supported by UNHCR. So the kind of, message about migration that this particular documentary was kind of giving was more in tune with the UNHCR, the kind of information dissemination that was embedded in the way UN as an organization functions, which is very different from the next clip I want to show, which is from one of the very interesting documentaries that we have seen in recent past, The Human Flow. Many of you, I presume, might have already seen it, by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And this is very different from a film like Shakespeare and Zaatari. Shakespeare and Zaatari, there is a kind of an amateur quality to it, because they were interested in working with the form and not making it like a kind of a polished feature documentary. Which is what Human Flow would do. It was kind of funded by Amazon. And also, Ai Weiwei is kind of a celebrity figure. He had to leave China, but then there is this constant way in which he's using different performative, platforms, including installations and other artworks to talk about migration. So Human Flow, what is interesting about this film is that it was shot in 23 countries, 59 refugee camps, and over a period of 1 year. So it's a massive documentation at its best. But there are also the ethical questions that Human Flow demanded from Ai Weiwei. Let's get to that in a second, but let's take a look at Human Flow. Before we get to Human Flow, these are some of the kind of artworks that I accompanied as part of my course, because the course was not just about films, it was also looking at artworks produced by asylum seekers and refugees when they are detained in the camps, waiting for their time period for giving testimonies. There is a long wait, and people do a lot of artworks, basically looking at their own kind of situation and engaging with others, talking about their narratives, etc. So these are few images from the project called Art in the Camps in 1988-91, and this is from Amsterdam. Let's take a look at Human Flow.
Being a refugee is much more than a political status. It is the most pervasive kind of cruelty that can be exercised against a human being. You are forcibly robbing this human being of all aspects that would make human life not just tolerable, but meaningful in many ways.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
الان 60 روزه با پسرم همینطوری داریم میچرخیم، ولی هیچ کس نیستش که بگه یه راهی رو بخواد به ما نشون بده. کجا برم زندگیمو شروع کنم؟
If children grow up without any hope, without any prospects for the future, without any sense of them being able to make something out of their lives, then they will become very vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, including radicalization.
المرفد الوحيد في غزة، في السجن الكبير غزة، مش في غزة، السجن كبير يعني.
The officials came here and told them, look, there's no way you're going to get papers to continue. Either you go voluntarily or we arrest you.
I respect you. I respect the passport and I respect
It's going to be a big challenge to recognize that the world is shrinking and people from different religions, different cultures are going to have to learn to live with each other.
You will notice from the film is the use of drawn shots. It uses quite a lot, and there's also kind of ethical questions about using drone shots, because in most cases, drone shots are being used for surveillance purposes in the border areas. And IYY also has this kind of a notoriety in terms of the question about ethics. There is one sequence which is kind of tangentially referred to here in the trailer, where he's actually saying that we are the same. But the basic critique is that IYY is a China exactly the same. So this is a documentary which also kind of inaugurated migration studies in terms of accounting for your own positionality, while also be very skeptical about the way in which certain images are to signify the huge and massive scape associated with migration, or thermal blankets that have for instance, this, people wearing orange life jackets, all of which have become like this part and parcel of the static thinking critically about what these images mean, because they actually, freeze you into thinking that these are the images through which we are witnessing the larger paradigm of migration, coming at us, and we do not have the capacity to stop it. So these are the questions which a lot of migration scholars are thinking through about the larger potential that media has. Violence that Walter Minolo talks about, and he's saying that even when you talk about migration, there is a kind of a decolonial lens that you need to bring in, that the colonial past and the extractive logic that is used in many cases to reallocate resources play a crucial part in the kind of refugee crisis that we saw in Europe, and the massive amount of lives that are lost in the Mediterranean. So moving on to the last clip I'll show for today, and this is from another interesting film called Infiltrators, which is very different from either Human Flow or Shakespeare and Zardari. Infiltrators is like a feature documentary, but this is also documentary, which is not really a documentary. So they use documentary footage, but there are also scenes of reenactment. And the focus of this documentary is basically to look at immigration detention centers in the United States, especially the one they focus on is in Florida, called the Broward Transition Center. What they are trying to do is the idea of infiltrating this particular detention center by Youth Alliance, National Immigration Youth Alliance. These are children who are basically born in the US. They are undocumented, but they are being protected by legal regulations under the Dreamers Act. So they basically infiltrate into this detention center, saying that they are undocumented. They just voluntarily surrender themselves, but their surrendering is also meant to disseminate information among the detainees on what are the possible legal claims they can have. How can they contact lawyers and other organizations working for their benefit? So let's take a quick look at the trailer from there.
Inside the matrix of 200 detention centers, almost 40,000 immigrants are locked up.
According to ICE policy, like your husband's not supposed to be in there at all. So it's the national ICE in DC that can do something.
1,400 deportations every day, one a minute.
We're just thinking about immigration.
My dad was detained in front of me.
Well, tonight, I have one question. Hi, how can I get in?
You're going to be transported to a detention facility.
We're all young illegals. Our mission is stop the deportations. Our strategy, get into the detention center and get people out.
There's a women's side to this detention center.
Are you ready to get detained?
I called my mom and my dad and I said, this is what I'm about to do. They were scared for their daughter.
Call this number with your case. They're waiting for your call.
Comunicar un cuchillo re filoso.
We can pass out a lot more phone numbers now.
Vamos a tratar de terminar 600 antes del almuerzo.
Uno no sabe dónde va a parar todo lo que está haciendo.
I don't know what you're up to, but from now on, things are going to be very different.
Her husband was beating her, and she finally went to the cops to turn him in, and then they detained her.
They're deporting Benny. His flight leaves tonight. I have somebody that's being deported in a couple hours. His life is in danger.
Gran espacio sentir. Tiré cualquier forma.
We're not leaving.
We're not leaving.
Todo el mundo gira buscando una guía. Pensar que haber otra manera.
Smile got released. Dreamer released. Dreamer released. Dreamer released.
Sostener un mundo justo. Otro día. Días de quebramento.
All right, so moving on to the kind of thematic clusters that I covered in my course. We started with basically the idea of what is a migrant image, how does it look like? And then we moved to transatlantic crossings. So that was important for me to actually show the kind of connections that we can draw from different historical, geographical, and cultural contexts. So from transatlantic crossings, we moved to indentured labor in the Caribbean, and then to Europe and artistic exploration of migration, then Mexico, Palestine, then again back to the idea of diasporic media, because we started the class with diasporic media, and I revisited diasporic media in regular intervals just to showcase the kind of connections that we can make between diasporic media and other media artifacts. So in diasporic media, we were looking at the Filipino labor in Hong Kong, and camps and detention centers, and the idea of indefinite waiting was another theme we covered. Finally, moving on to forensic oceanography and Rohingya crisis, and pure diasporic media and sub-Saharan Africa and migration. So if you look at it, there are a lot of jumps that I'm making, right from transatlantic crossings to like temporarily jump to indentured labor, and then different geographical focus, Europe, Mexico, Palestine, also diasporic communities in Southeast Asia, Rohingya crisis, and also like I briefly addressed the question about South Asian partition as well. But then this is also another question that you might be asked to reconsider. And after finishing the course, this is something I thought maybe I should not have had too many geographical jumps, because each and every class you'll have to give a brief historical, contextualization about the context that you're dealing with. When it comes to Mexico, you do not have to do that much, but when it comes to Palestine, Rohingya, all of which requires a lot of effort in terms of describing the context. And the description of the context sometimes takes away from the kind of theoretical and conceptual questions that you want to work on. And my students were mostly, masters and PhD students, and this was a 900 level, upper level course. So they were ready to read, but again, I think right now, looking back at the course when I was preparing the PowerPoint yesterday, the readings were kind of dense. So if you're relatively new to it, you might want to cut down the readings and make it a kind of a lecture heavy class so that students are at least attuned to what is it that you are trying to lay out for that particular week. Now, these are things which you already have in terms of the readings and how I structured it. And most of the classes demanded that students come up with a set of questions or observations from both the readings and some of the material that they have watched. And one student will be presenting on the film about how the film can be connected to the readings for the week. I also had a specific assignment, which is to ask them to bring a media artifact, which has got to do with migration according to the way they theorize migration. And each one of them were asked to do an oral presentation in the class, telling about how this migrant media is in conversation with some of the art materials and films that we have watched for the week. So I'm not going specifically into the readings. These are there in the syllabus I've shared with you. But what I want to show you is a few kind of images that I've used. And this is from an art project by Julia Salgado, who's a undocumented queer person. And they basically came up with this project called I am Undocumented Queer, basically to say the intersectional narratives that you can talk about when it comes to migration and media, where you're not just undocumented, but you're also queer. So how does your sexuality basically kind of help you to talk about the different levels of discrimination that are sometimes, part and parcel of the way legal systems function when it comes to, bringing your partner from elsewhere who, again, the question is about citizenship, who will be a productive citizen when they are brought back into the country, the kind of legal forms around it, etc. And these are some of the images, artworks that were part of it. These are all part of the border project, rethinking the idea of US-Mexico border. And people, artists were actually given a chance to go there to the Arizona desert and to use their kind of creativity to come up with art projects that can speak about the way in which borders and walls are basically containing the way in which people normally would have crossed over the borders, and the family, when families are being separated, half the families will be living in Mexico and the other half in the US part. So how do you kind of basically, come to terms with such a kind of psychological and traumatic event of separation? And this is Alberto Caro's Border Coffins, Marcos Ramirez, Toy and Horse. I just wanted to quickly go on to some of the questions I want to end today's conversation with, which is about what are we doing as educators, as people who are interested in teaching about migration, but also to a community who might not really know what is the value of migration per se in the larger global context. So how do you kind of have conversations globally about creating pedagogical practices that can speak about the need for migration? Migration is a social justice issue. Migration is an issue which is not solely, located on certain parts of the world. It's not affecting just, people coming from sub-Saharan Africa or from Iraq or parts of, Middle East. But it's also something which we need to constantly think about in terms of understanding methodological nationalism. I know that, basically Shafiq referred to methodological nationalism earlier, but I thought it's important for us to think about other frames of analysis that can be used to look at migrant media, because, scholars like Appadurai has written widely about how narrative requirements that are demanded by the modern nation state might not work really with refugees as a category, because the way modern nation state uses citizenship claims, borders, documentation, census, taxes, etc. as valid premises might not work for migrants who might not even have a valid documentation to prove that they belong to a particular place. Think about the Rohingya crisis or the nomadic communities, for instance. So if we think about nation states, there are categories like territory, language, common origins, ethnic affiliations, or even religions, all of which are seen as fixed entities, which in turn determines who belongs and who is forced to exit. So territorial integrity and ethnic singularity are seen as statist mode of controlling narratives to support state power. So questions of sovereignty and territorial integrity that nation state as a framework relies on is something which we need to think seriously if we were to design a course on migrant media, because migration is not about nation states. Migration is basically about challenging, compelling students to rethink the problematics of nation states. So when we talk about migration, we usually take Europe as a case study, and for valid reasons. The Mediterranean crisis is important enough, compelling enough for us to think of it as case study. And this again goes back to the theory of Westphalia of 1648 that became like the foundation idea of sovereignty, where there is a forced unity and coherence built by excluding those who do not fit into the collective imagination. So, or in the recent past, you can think about the Brexit, where there's this valid way of narrativizing the fact that you need to basically uphold the kind of citizenship claims that will veer people towards a kind of ethnic nationalism and populism. So I wanted my students to actually reflect on the Eurocentric biases that sometimes animate the way we design the courses or engage with intellectual orientation. So That's one of the reasons why I included guest lectures in my course. Basically, people who come from different parts of the world, who work on these issues, who are going to be a good spokesperson to think about the kind of research from their vantage point. Because as someone who is right now teaching in Global North in a university, predominantly dealing with white students, I'm also aware of sometimes, using it just as an additive metaphor to decolonize the curriculum. So one way of doing that is to be very conscious and open about the need to talk about the Eurocentric biases, even the kind of disciplinary orientations we come with, and what we can actually do to move out of that way of looking at adding a few indigenous scholars or adding a few scholars from Global South as one way of making it diverse, but to do something meaningful that can also make the students aware of the need to think differently, to move out of the box, and just to challenge the way in which sometimes disciplinary structures are formulated. Now, I'll end with one last thing, which is about pandemic. So this course was offered in my first semester at UW-Madison, and that's the time when I have not seen students and not even gone to my office. So everything was virtual. And since pandemic was backdrop, and we have seen the whole migrant trail in the context of India, when migrants were forced to walk back long distances during the peak time of the pandemic in 2020. So it became important for me to also talk about pandemic and migration in the course, even though it was not scheduled as part of the course structure. So we looked at the migrant image as a quasi-corporeal form, which is shaped by both ideological and mediated processes. So sometimes when you see the image of a suffering migrant body, it creates this idea of an effective economy of humanitarian work, right? Think about all the images we have come across as part of the pandemic wave of migrants walking long distances. Well, these images point out the potential of citizen journalism in initiating social action. They also hint at underlying affective metrics in which the figure of the migrant basically signify an impending catastrophe. In essence, such images resonate with what Wendy Hesford called the human rights spectacle. The grief and suffering-ridden migrant body and the raw aesthetic of such images turn the migrant into a site that embodies risk and one that is a rightful field of intervention. And this is not to say that humanitarian intervention is faulty, but rather than the mediation of intervention through images, risk reifying the idea of impromptu publics as a norm, rather than questioning the elision of community of care. So such moral publics that are formed around migrant victim imagery, it reacts to the plight of migrant victims, but again, they fix them in a frame of social stasis. The idea of iconicity, which fixes the people into this kind of binary of us versus them. This has been pointed out by a lot of scholars, including scholars like Bridget Anderson, who in her book on the idea of value creation, where she talks about the idea of good and bad migrants, victim versus celebratory accounts of migrants. What is it actually going to do in terms of us working with the idea of binary that basically refuses us to have a meaningful engagement with the idea of mobility? I think I'll probably stop here so that we can take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Darshana. I am actually quite happy with the way our lectures are coming together, because I have been thinking about how the United States, with all its associated issues and border controls and all kinds of new regulations coming up, especially as it did during the Trump regime, was something we are not addressing in much detail as part of this course. So some of the references that Darshana made helped us fill that lacuna. And of course, Dr. Poorna Banerjee's lecture next week will also address certain issues. But we began the course with Professor Lydia Potts asking us to write migration studies from the Global South, which I think our course has more or less managed to do so far. So four lectures came together. Again, I've already mentioned this. Pauladi's lecture last Saturday, Shefali's lecture on Sunday, and the two lectures today, each of which has compelled us to think of migrants not merely as subjects of research, not merely people we go to visit, not merely people we do our ethnographies with. Pauladi reminded us of the importance of having an ethics of care and constantly striving to make the voice of the migrant as much heard as possible. But also, Shefali looked at digital media and its uses through migrants to purposes which are very different from what their initial aim may or may not have been. Shafeeq, through photographs that Shafeeq showed us, we also again looked at the migrants as producers of objects and of meanings, and Darshana has given us a gamut of images, and I'm sure you are one with me in really appreciating the range of artifacts and objects and images created by migrants that she has put in front of us. I'm not even going to talk about the films. They are another thing altogether. So we are now open for questions. We only have 13 minutes, and we have a question from Shudeep Boshu in the chat box. If anyone else wants to ask a question or to comment, just raise your hand. As long as you're brief, I'll give you a chance. I'm going to read out Shudeep's question. Yeah, how important do you think it is to take Deleuze's idea of becoming minority or minor literatures seriously to apprehend refugee media situations in ethnic terms? How can non-migrants dominated groups be brought into a single frame in order to develop a communicative norm within a hierarchical social space? This is the question that we have for now. Darshana, you want to say something?
So actually, ethnic media, when I was dealing with in the course, was also trying to basically occupy the space of what it is to be a vulnerable other. So you're using vulnerability to your advantage, using and embracing the fact of being a minority to create and refashion identities and intellectual spaces that challenge constantly the dominant paradigms. So, ethnic media is not always about, sometimes there is this tendency to say that it is ethnic media, it is addressed only to the ethnic communities, or they are producing media for their own consumption. So some of the materials that I have used in this course was basically trying to challenge that. We have had a few video films made by Chinese community in the United States during 1968-69. They were basically trying to, align themselves with the Black activists and trying to talk about the need to, take racialized identity seriously. What does it mean to be actually talking about race, not as a Black, but as someone who identify with it, but also, being very aware of the fact that you cannot conflate identities. So my point about, like the way in which Deleuzean idea of minority literature, it's also giving space to basically talk about identities experienced from the vantage point of the subaltern. But I'm also interested in thinking about like what Shafeeq did in terms of what does it mean to actually look at those images or experiences which were not validated as celebratory narratives of migrant media years back. But right now we have a category, but when we are looking at those images in the broader category of migrant media, what changes? What changes is that, with the self-reflexive turn in migration, we're also being very aware of who we are. What are we bringing to the table? When we question, when we are basically asking questions to an interviewee who is at that point going through a vulnerable, traumatic moment, what are the kind of sensitive ways of framing our own intellectual curiosity in such a way that we are being respectful? So I would stop there.
Can I just make a little point here? I was also thinking, why the point about the communicative norm, which I was hinting at earlier, is to bring within this, whichever frame we are talking about, the interactive feature concerning both the migrant and the dominant other. And if that be so, then how does, changes with respect to identities, with stakes and everything happen? And you find even the dominant other think of themselves as a migrant, and then therefore there is a further change in situations. And that's what, it's an imaginative idea of what the future could entail. And that's one, bringing in Deleuze here a bit.
Yeah. Okay, so I might just need to take one strand from you, because communicative norms also work with a strict idea of hierarchy, where whose voice matters at what point of time is historically and socially conditioned. So I would say that I am a little reluctant to basically take that line, because I personally feel that, the idea Levinas puts when he talks about the other, the face of the other, is something which that is the kind of intellectual trajectory that I am attuned to and I'm interested in exploring, because you understand the other when you are morally obligated, when that moral obligation comes from inside, from understanding your own privilege of who you are. So the kind of empathy machine I refer to in some of the VR installations, while they all allow you to get a sense of informed through, but again, you can come back to the reality. So there is no way in which you can meaningfully engage, ponder over, introspect, or think through these questions. It's very spontaneous. Yeah, stop there.
Thanks, sir.
All right, Darshana, one of the things that we've been, one of the requirements of this course is setting up, there is an assignment. It's really embarrassing to call it for a workshop with teachers. So one of the quote unquote assignments is drawing a course outline for something that one would like to offer to their specific students from their specific disciplinary background. So I really liked the way you talked about the thematic and the considerations that you had to take into account in order to draw up your own course list. And while we were doing this, trying to draw this course, design this course, there were so many other considerations that we also had to keep in mind. Now, since so much of your course is also about media products, and you talked about students needing to talk about a media product every week, will you give us some insight into some of the things that the students brought to class, to their virtual class?
Yeah, sure. So this was only one assignment that they need to actually bring a media artifact. And that was like given a broad definition of anything that speaks to you about some of the conceptual questions that we have covered in the class. So this could be from mainstream films, which might just be taking a very negative kind of turn when it comes to immigration. But if that is the point you want to bring in, if that's the kind of speaking point you want to bring for the class, bring the image. So things students brought include poems written by either activists, or poems which we otherwise do not call as part of migrant media representations, but which has this idea of like, in between space, they are trying to actually understand your own kind of identity. Audre Lorde's poems were brought in, but they're not really media artifacts. But this, for the students, for them, they actually got a chance to justify what is it that is in the course that they can apply into other different context, their own context, or in other courses that they are doing in that point of time. So the things that students brought in were kind of really, really different. Some of them actually brought in images of things which are left behind in the border, dolls and all kinds of things. And it was like a very like emotional kind of moment, because you are actually seeing all the images, and they also be narrativized. What is it in the image that spoke out to them? And the talk, I ended today's session with this kind of dangers of the humanitarian spectacle. And that was something which I asked the students to also be really cautious about, that, some of the images, they become iconic images, so much so that you do not think what is beyond them. So that was a question I gave them, like, you need to reflect on that humanitarian spectacle, and Wendy Hesford's reading would be something you might want to take a look at if you just want students to also be very critically kind of aware of what is it that they bring. So in my class, I wanted like peer-to-peer work. So students actually commented on other students' papers. They will take a first look at it, they'll comment, I'll give them a broad rubric of what is it that I'm looking for when I'm finally grading. So it was interesting to see that, I want this a way of community of care and healing to also move into the realm of them critically looking at other person's work, but also being gracious and generous in doing it. Because sometimes, like it's very hard to read reviewer 2 kind of comments. So I thought that was one of the things which I want students to take away from the course, the idea of community of care. How can you build a community of care around the question of migration?
Thanks. Since there aren't any other pressing questions, I have one final question for you, which is something which is a conversation that we have been having at CRG for some time. So last year, as part of the winter workshop, we organized 2 dialogues, round tables on teaching migration. So one of them was centered in South Asia, the other centered in Europe. And some of the key questions, and you did talk about it when in your presentation, what are the basic ideas that you need to flag to your students, given that while we also live in a moment of massive migration, but also in a moment of extreme phobia against the migrants. And you also talked about how you have so many white students for whom it's only the specific Europe, US, Mexico might be the only context available. And even although you didn't say it, and I'm assuming that would be the case, it might not be something that they're viewing very positively at times. So what are the crucial, critical issues that you need to flag at the in this? Okay, Shonali has a question. So we'll just take Shonali's question. You may not answer mine, that's fine. So Shonali, will you be very brief, please?
Thank you, Shamota. Actually, I want to ask, like, migrants always contributed to the economy of the, whether Mexican with the United States of America or Bangladesh with India, migrants always contribute to your economy. But still migrants are not being given rights. They are being presented as fearful terrorists, that they are going to take our job. We need them, but still we do not have to give them their share, give them their rights, right? And in the literature also, or in the media also, they are being represented as they will take away your job, they are going to change your demography, or such kind of things are being narratives are there for them. So I want to know that why is it so that the people we need for our economy, for our development, for our growth is being denied from the basic human rights that they basically deserve? Why is it so that state actors or policy makers are not considering their rights?
Yeah, Shonali, thank you. This is going back to the question about the methodological nationalism, where nation states become the framing device, and the idea of who has citizenship claims and under what conditions can one be allowed to be a citizen. You can be a disposable part of labor force, but that's only as long as you require them here. And most of, like you rightly pointed out, most of these people who are being subjected to, random check by ICE are paying their taxes. And that is the kind of narrative that human rights activists and, migrant activists are putting on the table, that you need to take into consideration that they are paying tax. It's not like, they might not have documents, but this lack of documentation is also being created by the way immigration structures function in many of these countries in the global north, where you want a certain kind of model citizens to come in. So like I said about Canada, right now, they have this policy that artificial intelligence is going to actually sort out some of the temporary visa permits from India and China. And the reason is that you can easily flag who might be a prospective creator of problem. So the problem creator is basically drawn from different variables of other profiles of people who might be similar to you, but who might actually determine your prospects of being in Canada. So when data crunch is happening, when this whole idea of platform economy is happening, that's also having an impact on the way migration as an issue is being dealt by the state actors, because they're basically using that narrative in order to foreclose possibilities for a meaningful engagement. I'll stop it there and briefly talk, just say one or two things to Samitha. So Samitha, this course, having said that, it has been like a great course and great students, but it was not an easy course. I did have students who had really strong opinions about migration. I did have students who had issues with Palestine. And when I brought in a Palestinian scholar, I had to be like really, really careful. Just, this was like a ticking bomb out there. And you have to be very careful about what is it that you want the students to take from the lecture. And also to ensure the safety and comfort of the speaker who graciously accepted my invitation and came and spoke. Same with all the narratives about xenophobia. And, as someone who's relatively new to the department, and also like as a woman of color, it's also difficult to say my kind of political concerns. So needless to say, one of the evaluations I got from some of the students was like, she is an activist, and this was an activist course. This was like a social justice course in a gist. So everything boiled down to social justice. I'm happy they took it. But right now in the US, there is a massive pushback against critical race theory. And my course was also at the receiving end of it, when there were some of the students who said that, we are being asked to constantly rethink our privileges and white guilt and all of that. So it's a very difficult dynamics, despite it being like an upper level course, because, this course is housed in a department which has conventional film studies. So this is the first time they are even getting to know global media cultures. So there were too many firsts to the course that I had to constantly, put in a lot of emotional effort to say why I'm doing what I'm doing. Let's stop there.
Thanks, Darshana. I am sure it was a great course, and and although in your context it might not feel like it right now, to have a course that is geared towards social justice and to be an activist teacher is probably the best things that we can be. So thank you also to both Shafeeq and Darshana for sharing their work with us, for taking the time out. Thank you to the participants. Today we started much earlier. We started at 6. So thank you for showing up on a weekday before a long weekend. But I must test your patience once again. And tomorrow, do join us for a lecture on the Rohingya situation by Professor Amina Mohsin of Bangladesh, of Dhaka University, Bangladesh. So, and we shall end here. Thank you once again.